Are sloppy prisoner release practices putting public safety at risk? We've got an exclusive new internal audit from the Correctional Service of Canada. It flags some very serious problems with how inmates are released from custody and back into your communities. It warns that key administrative lapses could be undermining public safety and the way offenders are reintegrated. Let me show you what this internal audit says, and it's public now. In 23% of the cases the audit reviewed, victims were not notified before or on the day of the offender's release, as is required by CSC policy. Also, in 14% of the cases, there was no exchange of information between the institutional and the community parole officers. And the audit also found that offenders released without crucial items to help ease their transition back into the community, such as medication and key documentation like birth certificates, social insurance numbers, and even health cards. So this has raised a lot of questions. Why is Correctional Services of Canada failing to follow its own policies when it comes to releasing prisoners? And are these lapses putting public safety at risk? Let's get some reaction to this story. Candace Bergen is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety. Randall Garrison is the NDP's Public Safety Critic. And Wayne Easter is the Liberal International Trade Critic. All of you, good to see you. And let me start with Candace Bergen. This Correctional Services audit on the offender release raises a lot of concerns. It finds major systems failures about notifying key stakeholders on the release. For example, 23% of victims notified of an offender's release didn't find out until after this release. So does this impact public safety?
Well, I think we all agree that victims, I believe anyway, and my voting record would show that victims need to be notified 100% of the time. One of the things that we've done as a government is we've actually enshrined in law the ability for victims to receive this information, something the opposition opposed. So clearly it's incredibly important that CSC identifies where they have lapses, and I think it's key that we note that they were the ones who asked for this internal audit. They wanted to see where there were lapses and deficiencies, and we're pleased that they have accepted all of the recommendations that have come out of this audit and are already putting processes in place to make sure that certainly police officers, parole officers get the information that inmates who are being released, offenders who are being released, are given the documents that they need. But primarily that victims get the information. You know, it's a fairly new law. We passed Bill C-10. Again, if both of these gentlemen have their way, victims would have 0% of the information all of the time. We disagree with that. We believe victims need this information. I think the audit speaks for itself in terms of there were some areas of the country where things were done better, some areas where definitely improvement is needed. And so the recommendations are completely accepted by CSC. They're going to be following them. Okay.
By the way, it's not just for victims.
Absolutely.
The offenders didn't have birth certificates or health cards, so it's harder for them to reintegrate.
Correct. But I guess
can
we
you
are
give me a sense of
victims.
what happened here? Why weren't they getting this information?
Well, I think sometimes just the right processes. Again, according to the audit, and it's a fairly detailed document, certain processes were not in place or not adhered to properly all the time. That's what the recommendations address. But Evan, I think I would say, and I think Canadians would agree, victims do need to be a top priority. And once
this isn't just about victims, Candace.
Well, I know.
It's about rehabilitation in the justice system.
We know you're not concerned. Again, if you had it your way, you voted against.
Now that's not true, and
you actually did. You voted against C-10, which enshrines
but I mean,
in law.
I guess my fundamental question here
is
public safety at risk when offenders can't reintegrate? Randall Garrison.
Absolutely.
Well, obviously, public safety has got to be a top concern, and that includes notification to victims. And Candace certainly overstates when she says those who voted against C-10 voted against all of its provisions. I certainly never opposed notification for victims. But I would take some exception, Evan, with calling this sloppy. I think what this indicates is a system that's overstressed. And we've got a continuing problem with more inmates and fewer resources in the correction system to deal with them. So I think the audit reveals a severe problem that's only going to get worse because we're looking forward to cutbacks in the correction service budget again this year. I just don't know how they can accomplish all the tasks that are set out to make sure victims are notified and offenders are rehabilitated when you've got more people and fewer resources. So I think the government's going to have to explain how it's going to square that circle.
All right, Wayne Easter, what's your take when it comes to some of these higher risk offenders who are released on their warrant expiry dates, the audit points to sloppy paperwork, lack of notification of the offender's release. And let me just read this. The audit concludes here real quick. When critical information is not sent to police and other stakeholders concerning the release of offenders at risk of recommitting offences, there's an increase in the risk to the safety of the population.
There's no question, Evan, that CSC is falling down here. But what's the total reason why? This goes right to the very top and the way that the Conservative government has in fact handled the justice issues. Justice is not just about revenge, and that's what the Conservatives seem to be on the treadmill for, is revenge and penalties. It's you have to incorporate the total system in terms of rehabilitation and how people get back into society. They have never did a cost-benefit analysis on their law and order changes that they brought in, mandatory minimums. We're now seeing crowding in jails. We know there's been cutbacks in terms of Correction Services of Canada, and there isn't the ability within Correction Services Service Canada to do the job that they have to do. Simple things. I mean, the report, the audit says itself, and I've taken it off your website, that sloppy documentation upon release, it will injure offenders' reintegration into the community. Their reintegration may be jeopardized. And yes, we have to inform victims, but as well, we have to make sure that the offenders are rehabilitated in prison and don't come out better criminals than they went in. And the government has not looked at the total justice. They've only looked at revenge.
All right. Candace, Bergen, I want you to respond to that. But CSC, just so I give people a sense of this, spent $733 million on correctional interventions and community supervision. They have a budget total of about $3 billion. Will more money be allocated to monitoring mechanisms in the new budget?
A couple of things. First of all, again, the recommendations have been accepted completely. We have not cut funding for Correctional Service Canada. In fact, they didn't need all of the funding that was allotted to them because, contrary to what the opposition said, the population did not explode. But I want to address what Wayne said.
Well, it must have needed some money, to be fair, because they weren't doing their job on this side.
It's not always money, Evan. It's processes. And when you look at the actual audit and you look at the recommendations, it has to do with making those processes are in place. But certainly, I think it's quite interesting that both of these individuals are concerned, certainly as we are, with the offender, making sure that they are rehabilitated. But the primary reason is public safety. Public safety for the offender, public safety for law-abiding Canadians, public safety for the victims. And certainly we're very proud of the difference that our government is taking when it comes to offenders and the criminal justice system. The old Liberal way of focusing on the criminal, I mean, and now we see the NDP, what are they worried about over the last week? Their leader is in the U.S., not talking to the victim's family.
Are we talking political rhetoric here, Evan, or are we talking about the audit? Because
Wayne, I know, it's the truth. Let's focus on victims. When I look at this audit, I am concerned that not 100% of victims are notified, as our Conservative government made sure
Randall
was
Garrison's
legislated
question
in law.
that the system's overtaxed,
Absolutely.
and that's why things are falling through the cracks?
And this is where they try to have it both ways. They are upset because we're not building more prisons.
It's what the audit shows, Candace.
I'll just get Wayne. I'm just going to finish.
The audit shows.
The audit shows that there are deficiencies, but if these gentlemen have their way, there would be no information provided to victims. They voted against it, and when they have the opportunity, Evan, we got to call a spade a spade. This last week, the leader of the NDP party, was in the U.S. not talking to a victim's family. He was trying to get a criminal who shot a police officer 3 times back into Canada when he has no right to be here.
Okay, hang on. I don't want to debate the Freeman case. That's for a different...
I'm sure you don't.
Well, no, hang on, Candace Bergen. To be fair, we've actually had that on the show on several occasions. Today we're talking about the fact that CSC has failed to give documentation to offenders who are released, and we're also talking about the fact that victims aren't being informed. So we're just trying to keep it in the box there. To be fair, we're happy to have the Freeman discussion.
I think it's the focus.
But Randall Garrison, let me just get to you. Candace Bergen is saying that you're trying to have it both ways. So what is it? I mean, is there enough money? Do you want more money spent for monitoring mechanisms or not?
Well, yes, absolutely. If you're going to have more people in prison, you're going to have the record numbers of Aboriginal people in prison, and you want to have public safety, then you're going to have to spend money on the kind of things that this audit reveals as problems. If you want notification to victims, if you want people to complete their addiction treatment programs, you got to have more money in the system. When Candace says the number of people in prison hasn't exploded, it's at an all-time high. It has not reached the levels that some people predicted. It's still an all-time high, and we don't have enough resources in the system right now. That's what the audit shows, and that's what puts both public safety and victims at risk. So the government's got to provide the funding in this budget to accomplish the public safety goals it pretends to have.
Again, Evan, though, the responsibility here on the justice system as a whole and what's happening within our prisons in Canada, and the fact that prisoners are not being rehabilitated and victims are not being informed and police is not being informed, rests with Stephen Harper and his government. They're the ones that didn't allocate the resources. They're the ones that didn't do the cost-benefit analysis. And they have never looked at these issues in depth from a total justice system
now, but do you accept
rehabilitation ability.
Real quick, I got about 10 seconds,
Yep.
They've accepted all the recommendations in this audit. What's your view on that?
They have accepted the recommendations, but they have they allocated the resources and the processes to do the job. That's what's critical. All we're hearing from Candace over there is the typical rhetoric, law and order, and talking about victims. The justice system and more than just victims. It's rehabilitations. It's a system as a whole, and this government is an absolute failure in that regard.
Wayne, we're not doing things the old Liberal way, and he doesn't like it, but we're not going back to that way. Canadians don't want it.
The question is, what will happen? The audit found, and I'm quoting, the shoddy paperwork, poor communications, and haphazard help in inmates. Could that jeopardize public safety? We'll find out what steps are taken.
It's got to get better.
Candace, Bergen, Randall, Garrison, and Wayne Easter, lively panel today.